The aggressive red glare of the dead clock above the sink was not just a light source, it was a physical weight pressing down on Joral Nystrom's chest. He was 63, and the digital readout, flashing 300,000 credits, represented 5 years of his life, compressed into a single spiteful number. The low, chronic hum of the automated moisture regulators sounded less like machinery and more like the exhausted sigh of a dying beast. Joral leaned against the sterile polymer countertop of his habitat dome, tasting the air, a stagnant blend of recycled oxygen, old grease, and the perpetual cold scent of Velisca Prime's red dust trying to seep through the seals. Sector 11, Gamma, was 100 hectares of shattered promise. 5 years he had force-fed nutrient sludge into the ground, trying to coerce the sterile soil into accepting engineered earth strains. And 5 years the soil had chewed it up, leached the good chemicals, and spat back saline dust. He understood the true nature of colony farming. It was not cultivation. It was a mechanism for the Relith Consortium to engineer scarcity and collect perpetual rent. The universe, Joral often reflected, had substituted physics for honest morality, and he was losing the math. He needed a miracle, or at least something dramatically less legal than a miracle. That necessity had driven him 50 clicks toward the low-grade orbital ports, where whispers circulated about a shipment, less machinery and more biological anomaly, something cheap enough for a desperate man, powerful enough, perhaps, to break Relith's biofuture grip. The broker was named Archon Gresh, and he looked precisely like the kind of man who would sell the same dented speeder to 3 different people in 1 week. Gresh met Joral in a damp, unlisted hangar on the edge of the official docking zone. The air here was thick with the paranoia electric of high-voltage conduits and the sickeningly sweet smell of cheap, recycled polymers. Bad intent hung in the humidity like static. Gresh presented the merchandise as assets, 4 young females, vaguely insectoid in structure, from a planetary designation long since struck from the maps. They stood motionless inside a narrow, repurposed container, covered in thin, gray maintenance shrouds. The official paperwork Joral had reviewed called them bio-assimilatory units. Joral called it slavery with a better marketing budget, but he kept his voice flat. The Thriss daughters, Gresh drawled, tapping a shard of data crystal against his synthetic palm. Inherited assets. They interface. Living tools. Extremely specialized. They don't need instruction, Nystrom. They need proximity. Joral looked at the shrouds. He felt a knot tighten deep in his abdomen, the kind of physical stress that had nothing to do with lifting heavy sacks of fertilizer and everything to do with moral corrosion. The price Gresh demanded was astronomical. It required Joral to leverage his remaining pension, his land rights, and the future yield of crops he had no earthly guarantee of growing. Total ruin hinged on this transaction. They look frail, Joral noted, his voice strained by fatigue, industrial. Gresh shrugged, a movement of bored efficiency. They are expensive because they work. Cruelty is sometimes the highest form of efficiency. Farmer. They are genetically optimized to harvest complexity. That's what Relith paid for when they were originally commissioned, before the family liquidated. Joral did not argue. He pulled the transfer protocols onto his handheld. The holographic ink burned the outline of his financial ruin, not onto a screen, but onto the skin of his palm. He traded everything he owned for 4 strangers and a hope that smelled strongly of bad faith and desperation. He brought the 4 Thriss back to Sector 11 Gamma in the back of his utilitarian transport. The small habitat dome, which had felt empty for so long, felt immediately too crowded, too quiet. The anxiety made the oxygen thin. Joral set the container down. The 4 units remained motionless. He worked slowly, his hands rough and unsteady, stripping the maintenance shrouds away. He revealed intricate, chitinous forms, delicately jointed, built like biomechanical clocks. Their heads were smooth, housing large, soft, black eyes that watched him without judgment, only observation. Lyra, the eldest, if he could even use that term for engineered beings, stepped forward, her movement precise, utterly silent. Kale, Zis, and Fawn remained slightly behind her, a geometric formation. Joral offered them synthesized nutrient rations and water. They accepted the water eagerly, but ignored the rations. Lyra made a small gesture with one delicate hand, pointing not toward the food, but toward the broken, salt-crusted soil outside the dome. Joral was 63 and a bioengineer by trade, not a slaver by choice. He knew how to treat an instrument. The ethical confusion lay in the fact that these were clearly sentient instruments. "Look," Joral said, rubbing the stiff back of his neck. His breath hitched, a purely physical symptom of fear. "Gresh said you interface. I bought you. I used every credit I had to get you here. I need this soil to yield. I don't care how you do it, but if we fail, we all fail. I don't issue orders. I ask for partnership." He pointed to the 100 dead hectares, lit by the harsh distant sun of Valiska Prime. Lyra nodded once, a barely perceptible tremor of her head. It was a sign of comprehension, not obedience. The other three followed her out through the airlock and into the blinding light and dust. They did not touch the soil directly. They simply stood there, about 10 feet apart in a rough square. They were radiating something, a low-level, high-frequency energy that Joral's external monitors initially registered as aggressive static interference, the sort that made the back teeth ache. Then, Joral watched. The sisters began to whisper to the ground, not with their mouths, which remained closed, but with a subtle manipulation of the local electromagnetic fields. He watched the red dust shimmer. They weren't fighting the environment. They were redefining its parameters. They guided the latent microfauna, directed the saline crystallization deep below the surface, and started, fundamentally, to rewrite the planetary operating system. What followed was not farming, it was architectural genesis. Within 3 solar cycles, the red dust of 11 Gamma was gone. In its place grew a vast, pale green structure that pulsed faintly. It was part fungus, part resin, part engineered crystal. The Thriss had taken Joral's failed nutrient base, repurposed the chemical waste, and constructed a self-sustaining biostructure. It drew moisture directly from the thin atmosphere via capillary action, processed the harsh solar radiation into complex sugars, and excreted perfect, potable water as a waste product, which collected in clear pools at the base of the dome. It was a closed loop, perfectly tuned to the hostility of Valiska Prime. This was the Citadel, layered walls that healed themselves, chambers structured like honeycombs that filtered air and moderated temperature, and central conduits that pulsed with warm, clean fluid. Joral realized the enormity of their capability. They didn't just grow things, they designed ecosystems. They were living biodigital architects. Lyra stood beside a newly formed wall, watching a beetle-like scavenger interact with the resin, testing its durability. "Efficiency," she stated, her voice a dry whisper, confirming the single, cold word Gresh had used, but removing the cruelty from the definition. Joral laughed, a rough, unused sound that felt painful in his throat. The Citadel was not just a farm, it was the blueprint for a civilization that didn't need the Relith Consortium's expensive steel and silicon imports. It was a declaration of independence, constructed entirely from the planet's own dust. The Consortium notices anomalies with the speed of a vulture spotting carrion. 2 standard weeks after the Citadel began its vertical expansion, a sleek black transport hovered over 11 Gamma, its engines generating a deep, intimidating rumble that vibrated through Jaral's bones. Stepping out was Archon Gresh. His cheap synthetic suit had been replaced by Relith corporate armor, and he was flanked by 2 armed enforcement drones that hummed with high-voltage menace. Gresh's face was sharp with calculated greed. He pointed a gauntleted finger at the Citadel's shimmering dome. "Nistrum!" Gresh's voice boomed, amplified by the suit's speaker, a low threat vibrating in the air. The contract had an overlooked clause. The value of the assets was clearly underestimated. Any derivative works created by the assets using supplied materials belong solely to the original owner during the initial adjustment period. Jaral stood at the entrance to his new biohome, the air cool and clean against his skin, a sensation of genuine peace he hadn't felt in 5 years. Gresh smiled, a chilling corporate gesture. "This is mine, farmer, and so are they." Joral felt the familiar hot rise of anger, the 63 years of accumulated injustice, but this time it was tempered by the sheer, immovable weight of the structure behind him. The Thriss daughters emerged behind him. Lyra's expression remained unreadable, but the subtle, resonant humming of the citadel seemed to intensify, vibrating through the metal of Gresh's transport. The low frequency felt like a warning. "You sell tools, Gresh," Jaral stated, his voice calm, lacking any visible strain. "I bought tools, but I didn't pay them in credits. I paid them in autonomy and resources." He stepped aside, revealing a small, integrated terminal set seamlessly into the resin wall, biological fiber wrapping around the metal interface. "The Citadel is an autonomous, self-replicating ecosystem," Joral continued, watching Gresh's greedy eyes flicker. "It is growing, exporting excess resources, and generating proprietary energy, all outside the Relith network." Gresh scoffed, an oily sound. "You think a smart wall stops a lawsuit and 2 armed drones?" "No," Joral replied, his eyes locked on the broker, "but complexity defeats bureaucracy." He activated the terminal. Instantly, the Citadel, under Lyra's direction, executed a massive data burst. It wasn't a virus. It was an economic declaration. The Thriss had embedded complex, self-adjusting market algorithms into the structure. Within seconds, the Citadel began offering nutrient paste, purified water, and structural components, all superior quality, at 1/10 the Relith market price, flooding the entire local colonial market. Furthermore, the bioarchitecture was designed to actively degrade any Relith-patented structural material that came into contact with it. "Your property," Joral finished, a cold certainty in his voice, "just optimized the regional economy into obsolescence. The moment you destroy this building, you destroy the only cheap source of sustenance for 200,000 colonists." He paused, letting the scope sink in. "And the moment you touch the daughters, the design patents, which are physically embedded in their DNA and protected by off-world legal entities, become void. The entire Citadel and all its blueprints goes public domain, free for anyone to replicate. You lose the monopoly, Gresh. You lose everything." Gresh stared, his corporate greed paralyzed by catastrophic legal and economic complexity. His drones hovered uselessly. The only thing worse than an angry 63-year-old farmer was an angry 63-year-old farmer with partners who could weaponize biology and corporate law against engineered scarcity. The Relith transport lifted, retreating from the low, intensifying hum of the Citadel, leaving only a cloud of red dust behind. Joral watched it go. He hadn't won a battle. He had simply built a better system. The debt clock above his sink went dark entirely, the hateful red replaced by a green, quiet indicator of surplus. He was, briefly, paralyzed by the simple absence of the chronic pressure. He looked at the 4 figures, standing silently beside the resin wall. They were not property. They were the foundation. He had bought 4 lives to save his own, and in granting them autonomy, They had built the scaffold of human independence in the outer rim, but victory was never clean. The core problem, Joral knew, wasn't Gresh. Gresh was just the symptom. The vastness of the consortium, their endless resources, and their commitment to engineered scarcity meant that this was only the first minute of the war. They had retreated, but they had not surrendered. Joral pressed his hand against the smooth, living resin of the citadel wall, feeling the warm, continuous pulse of the structure. He had leveraged his debt into a declaration of war against the richest power in the sector, armed only with a better way to filter water and 4 enigmatic architects. The citadel was an immense target, too complex to destroy easily, but also too delicate to defend conventionally. He looked back at Lyra. Her black eyes regarded him with intense, alien patience. They will come back, Joral thought, tasting the stale air again, now tinged with the faint, sweet smell of growing resin. And next time, it won't be Gresh. He knew, with absolute certainty, that they had just traded financial ruin for a galactic confrontation. His heart, however, felt lighter than it had in a decade. The cost of true autonomy, he realized, was everything you had left. The low residual tremor left by the retreating Relith transport finally faded, leaving a silence that felt less like peace and more like a vacuum before atmospheric pressure drops. Joral kept his hand pressed to the citadel wall, the resin surprisingly warm, pulsing with the slow, steady rhythm of the complex life support systems Lyra and her sisters had woven. He had expected the light-headedness of victory. What he got was the sharp, metallic tang of administrative dread. Proprietary energy, he muttered to himself, pulling his handheld from his belt. The green surplus indicator was indeed glowing above his sink, inside the dome, but that was physical power. Financial power, he knew, ran on compliance protocols. He needed to normalize the Citadel's massive, uncontrolled energy output, which the Thriss had designed to be entirely independent of Relith's grid, or the consortium wouldn't bother with expensive drones. They would simply flag him for unauthorized infrastructure and freeze every credit transfer connected to Sector 11 Gamma, starvation by spreadsheet. He turned toward the 4 Thriss, who were now standing together near the open airlock, their movements unnervingly synchronized. Lyra stepped forward, sensing his shift in focus. The Citadel needs external designation, Joral explained, holding up the handheld. Energy regulation. To legally exist, you need to plug into the regional power architecture, even if you don't draw from it. We set the output to reserve export and pay the compliance tariff. Lyra tilted her head, a gesture of intellectual curiosity. The tariff is the cost of not being destroyed, Joral said, his voice dry. It buys us time. He spent the next 2 hours wrestling with the clunky, Relith-mandated colonial interface. It was deliberately opaque, designed to frustrate independent users into hiring expensive Relith technicians. Every drop-down menu led to 4 submenus, each demanding biometric authentication that often failed on the first 3 attempts. The stress began to pull at the thin, fibrous scar tissue running across the back of Joral's left hand, an old mining injury that always flared under psychological pressure. His hands, usually rock steady from 60 years of physical labor, were beginning to tremble slightly. He didn't sweat. His body just went cold, drawing resources away from the surface to fuel his brain's grinding frustration. He finally reached the crucial point, the Energy Regulator Designation Form, Standard Colonial Protocol 9 Alpha. He entered the Citadel's geo-coordinates, declared its autonomous status, and listed its estimated surplus output, enough to power a small moon, generated with 0 atmospheric impact. He hit Submit. The screen froze for 7 seconds that stretched into the geological age. Then, a sterile, synthesized voice cut through the hum of the Citadel, coming directly from the handheld's internal speaker, crisp and entirely unfeeling. Processing error, account status violation. Jorrell swore, a quiet, effective word taught to him by a mechanic decades ago. Status violation? What status violation? He dug deeper, navigating through the error logs. The original debt clock, now dark, had been the key, while the Citadel's success had rendered the debt practically moot by generating unlimited internal resources. The legal transfer of those resources required his account to be in good standing, and it wasn't. The consortium's core architecture had automatically flagged Jorrell Nystrom as a financial flight risk the moment he leveraged his entire pension to buy the Thriss daughters. The system hadn't waited for him to default. It had classified him as perpetually high risk, locking down any large-scale asset generation until a full 50-year financial review was completed. Jorrell stared at the screen, a cold realization dawning. Gresh's tactical retreat hadn't been a defeat. It had been a delaying action, allowing the slower, deadlier bureaucratic machinery to engage. Complexity defeats bureaucracy. He had told Gresh. He had been wrong. Bureaucracy, weaponized by the consortium, thrived on its own complexity. It used protocol like an anesthetic, designed to put the opponent to sleep while the system bled them dry. He needed an authorized administrator to manually override the status flag. A direct approach was impossible. Relith did not employ people who cared. They employed filters. He activated the intersector communication channel using a secure deep-band encryption protocol Lyra had silently embedded in the Citadel's comms array. He wasn't contacting Relith. He was contacting the regional administrator assigned to Sector 11 Gamma, a woman whose name he only knew from automated payment notifications, Cylon Ward. The connection was slow, sputtering. The air suddenly smelled less like clean resin and more like ozone and stale coffee. After a painful 30 seconds, the screen resolved into a low-resolution image of a woman in a perfectly tailored synthetic gray uniform. Cylon Ward looked tired, framed by the flicker of bad fluorescent lighting in an office that felt 300 light-years away. She was perhaps 40, with sharp eyes that carried the permanent fatigue of someone fighting a losing battle against paperwork. Sector 11, Gamma, Cylon Ward stated, her voice clipped, professional, and entirely devoid of human inflection. This line is for critical infrastructure failure only. You are listed as surplus, Nystrom. I have a critical failure of compliance protocol 9 Alpha, Jorrell countered, keeping his tone measured. My account status has been erroneously flagged as high risk, preventing the legal declaration of a critical resource hub. Ward sighed, an audible, practiced gesture of long-suffering. Nystrom, your file is massive. You went through a high-leverage acquisition involving bio-units, then generated anomalous infrastructure. The system automatically classifies you as hostile economic activity. It's not erroneous, it's logical. Logic doesn't feed 200,000 colonists with cheap water, Ward. My new asset, the Citadel, is already exporting. If I can't register its power source, the entire operation is illegal. Relith will seize the structures and sell the patent rights to the highest bidder. Ward leaned forward slightly, her eyes finally showing a flicker of genuine interest, or maybe just professional curiosity. Wait, you built the biostructure that crashed the regional market on nutrient paste? Relith Legal is already writing 500,000 words on that violation alone. Jorrell suppressed the urge to rub his temples. It wasn't a violation. It was optimized efficiency. I need you to manually clear my account status so I can formalize the power designation. I need a temporary 72-hour window. That's all. Ward gave a small, humorless smile. You're asking me to manually override Relith's primary financial defense algorithm. You think I have that kind of clearance? You're the sector administrator. You have the access codes, Jor-El insisted. I have the access codes to file maintenance requests, Nystrom. The system is designed so no single human can legally grant high-risk exceptions. That's the point. Decentralized control ensures systemic compliance. She was the bureaucracy, embodied. She was neither cruel nor kind. She was simply a function of the system he was fighting. He realized then the true genius of the consortium. They didn't rely on malice. They relied on distributed accountability. If no one was truly responsible, no one could truly help. Jor-El leaned back against the warm resin wall, feeling the low, vibrant hum of Lyra's creation flowing through him. The pressure in his head ratcheted up, reminding him of a time nearly 30 years ago when he was trying to grow hydroponic wheat in the asteroid belt. The entire crop failed because he miscalculated the exact trace mineral needed. He had traded 6 months of his life for 20 tons of useless dust, all because of an unmet protocol. Always the protocol, always the fine print. Ward, Jor-El said, his voice dropping, becoming intimate and gravelly. I bought 4 beings who were treated as tools. I gave them resources and autonomy, and they gave me the only honest architecture this planet has ever seen. If Relith dissolves this partnership, they will kill the only sustainable source of life in this sector. You saw what Gresh did. This is about leverage, not just money. Ward's expression hardened. Her eyes shifted to a point above his head, likely the camera lens. Your bio units are irrelevant to Protocol 9 Alpha. Nystrom, you are fighting the system that houses you. The only manual intervention permitted at my level for high-risk accounts is isolation. Isolation? Shutting down your comms, freezing your external exports, and placing you under remote physical observation until the 50-year review is completed. Ward delivered the information with the detached calm of a medical drone delivering a lethal injection. It's the simplest way to reduce risk. It's not malice, Nystrom. It's efficiency. She was echoing Gresh's word, but where Lyra had redefined it to mean harmonious creation, Ward used it to mean systemic suffocation. You have 72 hours before Relith's automated compliance audit triggers the isolation protocol, Ward continued, checking a timer on her own screen. But since you brought this to my attention on a critical line, I am legally obligated to expedite your file review. Consider that 36 hours. She was cutting his time in half. She wasn't an antagonist. She was the clock. Jor-El felt the cold sweat on his neck intensify. He was facing a countdown to an economic siege. 36 hours to achieve what Relith had spent centuries building defenses against. Lyra approached him, her chitinous hand hovering near his arm. She didn't speak, but he felt the shift in the Citadel's vibration, a faster, more complex oscillation. She had understood the threat without hearing the words. The system wanted them isolated, immobilized, and eventually dismantled. Jor-El met Ward's tired eyes one last time. Isolation means everyone starves when the consortium prices them out. Isolation means Relith maintains market stability, Ward corrected. She didn't wait for a reply. The screen went dead, replaced by the flickering corporate logo of the Relith Consortium, a stylized spiral designed to resemble a black hole slowly consuming light. Jor-El turned back to the Citadel's terminal, his mind racing. 36 hours. He couldn't beat the system by complying. He had to beat it by going entirely off-grid, truly independent and invisible. Lyra gently touched the metallic interface on the resin wall. Her head tilted toward Jor-El, then toward the console. He sensed, rather than heard, the implicit question. How do we make the Citadel disappear from their sight? Jor-El looked at the massive, pulsating biodome they had built, an immense, permanent structure. You couldn't hide a skyscraper, but the Citadel wasn't a skyscraper. It was a living organism, He remembered the secondary rumors Gresh had whispered in the hangar, rumors he had dismissed as desperation, about the Thrist daughters being bioengineers, yes, but also navigators, whisperers to the complex mathematics of folding space. Joral took a deep breath, the clean, conditioned air feeling like a lie. We don't hide it, Lyra. We move it. We need to detach the Citadel from 11 Gamma entirely. We need to find somewhere Relith's bureaucracy can't follow. He looked at the orbital path data displayed on the corner of the terminal, the constant stream of Relith supply convoys. Tell me, Joral asked the 4 silent partners, the weight of their combined survival heavy on his 63-year-old shoulders. Can you make an ecosystem jump? Can you make an ecosystem jump? The question hung in the air, heavy with the implied mathematics of spatial mechanics and survival. Lyra answered not with sound, but with motion. She moved to the central core terminal, placing both delicate, chitinous hands flat on the glowing resin. The structure vibrated faster now, a high-frequency thrum that Joral felt in his teeth, shifting from a comforting pulse to a song of acute readiness. The Citadel, she conveyed through the subtle energy signature change, could be folded, not instantaneously, like military displacement drives, but organically. It required a full-spectrum power spike, focused into the foundational root system that anchored the biodome to the dust of 11 Gamma. The Nexus, Joral confirmed, looking through the dome at the exposed external power junction, a crude metal box he'd bolted to the outside 5 years ago. It was the only access point Relith's grid could conceivably use, even for observation. We need to overload it and detach cleanly, or the feedback will fry the internal regulators. He checked the handheld again. 36 hours had been generous. With Ward's expedited file review, the compliance audit would hit in less than 20. I'll go out and prime the Nexus. You start the sequence, Joral instructed. Give me 15 minutes to rig the thermal shunt. We need a clean break. The transition from the cool, filtered air inside the Citadel to the abrasive, hot dust of Velisca Prime hit Joral like a physical blow. The environmental suit seals whined faintly. The outside smelled strongly of hot metal, ozone, and the perpetually stale salinity of the desert. He moved quickly, his 63 years pressing down on every joint, forcing him to think 2 steps ahead to conserve energy. The Nexus box was rusted, caked in red dust. He wrestled the main service panel open. Inside, the copper bus bars were thick with 5 years of ambient static humming aggressively. His plan was simple. The Citadel's surplus power was astronomical. If he bypassed the regulator and sent the entire reserve spiked directly into the ground, anchors for 4 seconds, the shock wave would shear the biostructure from the substrate, leaving Relith with nothing but an empty lot and a phantom power signature. Joral worked with practiced precision, his hands moving the thick, grease-coated cables. The effort brought a stinging, cold sweat to his forehead. He had traded intellectual dread for physical danger, a trade he preferred. At least out here, the rules of engagement were defined by gravity and current, not by corporate fine print. He was reaching for the primary thermal shunt clip when the humming changed. It wasn't the Citadel's accelerating thrum. This was a deeper, more dissonant chord, vibrating violently through the metal box. It felt like high-frequency white noise focused directly on his central nervous system. Jamming, not Gresh's drones, but something far more sophisticated, delivered by Relith's orbital infrastructure, targeting the exact frequency the Thriss were using to weave the jump sequence. Joral felt the residual charge in the Nexus spike violently. The energy wasn't dissipating. It was building, trapped by the external interference. Lyra, abort! He yelled into his helmet mic, but the jamming frequency made his voice sound flat and distant, swallowed by the noise. The Nexus exploded. It wasn't a clean, contained detonation. It was a searing flash of blue-white electrical fire mixed with molten copper. Joral threw himself backward into the dust, his suit shield flickering violently against the localized burst. The thermal shunt he had been holding vaporized, leaving nothing but a wet, acrid smell of burnt plastic and something organic. His suit's outer polymer layer melted instantly. He staggered to his feet, tasting blood in his mouth from the rapid overpressure. The right side of his suit, where the molten material had splashed, was smoking slightly. The external comms were dead, replaced by the grating static. The structural failure was immediate. The localized EMP, intended not to kill Joral, but to sever the Citadel's ability to move, had partially succeeded. The biodome still stood, but the coordinated folding process was violently interrupted. Joral watched in horror as a section of the shimmering green resin wall, spanning about 50 meters, turned sickly gray and slumped inward, degassing violently. The Citadel had tried to fold, but the interference had created a shear zone, a critical wound in the living architecture. He dragged himself back towards the airlock, his right arm throbbing with pain, the nerve endings screaming, where the melted polymer had contacted his skin through the suit liner. Inside the dome, the atmosphere was chaotic. The central air filtration system, starved of its stabilized power input, was cycling erratically. The air was thick and hot, smelling of burnt oil and the strange, sweet odor of stressed resin. The four Thriss stood near the fractured wall section, watching the system failure with absolute clarity. Kyle, the smallest, was frantically interfacing with the conduit, trying to force the structural fluids back into the damaged section. The navigation core, Joral choked out, ripping off his damaged helmet. The pain in his arm was blinding, but secondary to the immediate threat. They jammed the primary fold. Did they touch the navigation? Lyra turned, her large black eyes reflecting the fluctuating emergency lighting. She didn't need to speak. She pointed to the main terminal. The projected orbital map was a mess of corrupted data, a kaleidoscope of flashing red lines and geometric impossibilities. The deep band comms were useless. Relith had effectively blinded them, leaving the Citadel anchored and immobile, a vast, visible, and now vulnerable target. Fawn, the third sister, stepped forward, her movement decisive. She extended a thin, jointed appendage toward the corrupted terminal. It wasn't a hand. It was a cluster of fine, bioengineered tools, optical lenses and conductive filaments. With a quick, sharp motion that made Joral wince, she snapped one of the filaments off the cluster. It was a clear, crystalline structure, glowing faintly. Fawn inserted the living crystal into the terminal's main data port. A gasp of clean data flooded the screen. The corrupted map snapped back into focus, but the image was fractured, overlaid by a complex, pulsating grid of interference. "Temporary bypass," Lyra whispered, her voice dry and strained. The effort of the failed jump and Fawn's sacrifice was costing them. The sacrifice hadn't fixed the problem. It had just given them a narrow, temporary sightline. The crystal filament was burning up fast, oxidizing under the strain of continuous Relith jamming. Joral leaned heavily on the terminal, ignoring the blinding pain in his arm. He looked at the orbital path data. The automated compliance audit had been triggered by the EMP event, flagged as structural sabotage. Relith had decided the siege was over. A new marker appeared on the horizon display, fast and heavy. A patrol vessel, designated Vigilance 4, accelerating on an interception course. Estimated arrival, 6 minutes. This wasn't Gresh. This was military, equipped with specialized hull-breaching capability. Joral knew the drill. The Vigilance 4 wouldn't bother with legal complexities. They would simply extract the Thriss daughters as high-value intellectual property and incinerate the Citadel. 6 minutes. They couldn't repair the primary fold mechanism, and they couldn't outrun the patrol vessel. The Citadel was vibrating again, but this time the internal hum was a deep, mournful groan. Lyra pointed to the screen. The jump coordinates were restricted to 2 options. 1. A full, catastrophic collapse of the Citadel structure, releasing all its biomass into the desert, blending back into the sterile dust. This would erase the evidence and buy Giral time to escape Sector 11 Gamma on foot, abandoning everything. The blueprint, the hope for the sector, would be gone. 2. A desperate, short-range displacement jump to the ether scar, a chaotic, unmapped asteroid field 20,000 kilometers out. The jump probability was rated at 25%. The destination was unstable, and the Citadel's damaged structure might not withstand the internal stresses of spatial displacement. It was the choice between certain failure, erasure, and probable death, the scar. Giral looked at the 3 sisters, Lyra, Kale, and Zis, who were supporting Fawn, whose crystalline filament was rapidly dissolving into the console. They had sacrificed their security, their comfort, and now a part of their own physical being for this structure, for this partnership. "We don't erase it," Giral decided, his voice raspy, the scent of burning insulation still sharp in the warm air. "We jump. We risk the scar." Lyra nodded, a profound relief crossing her expression, almost visible through the alien composure. To achieve even the short, blind jump, they needed an instantaneous, uncontrolled power surge, far greater than the failed spike at the Nexus. Giral activated the Citadel's emergency override panel. "We need to shunt power from the structural integrity field into the dimensional capacitor. It will destabilize the dome temporarily, but we need the focus." The sisters braced themselves. Giral gripped the heavy manual lever, his good hand tight on the cold metal. He had to overload the capacitor while the filtration system was cycling dangerously high, pulling air too fast through the stressed resin walls. He pulled the lever. The hum became a shriek. Giral felt the pressure drop violently inside the dome, a physical vacuum hitting his eardrums. The floor beneath his boots shifted, the resin seeming to warp and stretch like hot taffy. The damaged section of the wall groaned and began to peel back, exposing the raw, hostile red air of Valiska Prime outside. The dimensional capacitor overloaded with a sound like tearing silk. The Citadel began to blur, the walls vibrating so fast they became translucent, the interior lights strobing erratically. Giral was thrown against a pulsing resin wall, the impact slamming the air from his lungs. The pain in his right arm intensified tenfold. He slid down the wall, gasping for the thick, hot air, trying to focus on the terminal. The jump indicator flashed red. Sequence initiated. The Citadel groaned again, warping into an impossible shape as the displacement field took hold. Giral knew they were moving, but moving blind, hurtling toward a field of lethal orbital debris. Just as the world outside turned into a blinding streak of relativistic light, an untraceable, non-encrypted signal managed to cut through the jump static, broadcast from the inbound Relith patrol vessel, Vigilance 4. The voice was deep, cultured, and utterly devoid of emotion, a man identified only as Seren Jokrin. "Nistrum," the voice stated, clear despite the mounting spatial distortion. "You just declared independent status in a system owned by the consortium. That is not inefficiency. That is treason." The signal cut out, and the Citadel, ripped free from its foundations, vanished entirely from Sector 11 Gamma, leaving behind only an immense, smoking circle of fused rock and the chilling finality of Jokrin's pronouncement hanging in the dust. Giral blacked out, his head resting against the warm, trembling resin floor. The jump completed, but the question of where they had landed, and whether the Citadel was now a functioning home or merely a rapidly decaying coffin, unanswered. The warm, constant hum of the resin floor was gone, replaced by a deep, shivering cold that seeped into Jaral's bones. He woke slowly, the pain in his right arm a constant, grinding static beneath his consciousness. When he opened his eyes, the interior of the citadel was bathed in the thin, sickly blue light filtering through the strained resin walls. The air, though still breathable, carried a sharp, metallic odor of cryogenic frost and something deeply unsettling, the scent of dying vegetation. The complex, self-healing architecture was losing its integrity. The citadel was not a home. It was a lifeboat rapidly taking on water. Lyra, Kale, and Zis were huddled near the main terminal, their backs to him. Fawn was still, resting against Zis, the site where the crystalline filament had been torn away, covered by a pale, temporary resin patch. The energy drain had been catastrophic for her. Jaral sat up, pushing against the cold, pulsing floor. His good hand went to his arm. The thermal burns were superficial, but the internal bruising from the pressure shock was profound. "Where are we?" he managed, his voice dry and raw. Lyra turned. Her black eyes were wide, reflecting the distant, chaotic starfield outside. "The ether scar," she whispered, her voice weaker than before. "We are adrift. The structure holds, but we are venting energy faster than we regenerate." She pointed to the main screen. Instead of a clear navigational field, the display showed a dense, swirling cloud of orbital debris, millions of kilometers of frozen rock, shattered ships, and dark matter pockets, all colliding at unpredictable velocities. The citadel was an immense, slow target in an ocean of fragmentation. The sheer loneliness of the ether scar was palpable. Relith's bureaucracy was not here, only physics. Joral pushed himself to the terminal. Fawn's temporary bypass had burned out, but before it failed, it had recorded a data cache. "What did Fawn find?" Joral asked, tapping the remaining power indicator, now cycling weakly between yellow and red. Lyra projected the file onto the screen. It wasn't a transmission log from the Vigilance 4. It was an archived research file, dated 50 years prior, bearing the internal Relith designation, Project Chimera. Joral scanned the dense, technical jargon, his exhaustion fighting his deep-seated curiosity. He was a bioengineer. The language of deep-level genetic coding and spatial compression made ugly sense to him. The Thrist daughters were never meant to be bio-assimilatory units. That was the commercial marketing label. They were engineered as sentient, organic conduits, designed for a massive, multi-sector terraforming effort Relith had abruptly terminated due to political instability and rising costs 5 decades ago. Their true purpose was instantaneous, massive data transfer. They didn't simply grow things. They could compress and transfer the entire informational architecture of an ecosystem, its full biological and structural blueprint, across interstellar distances via localized fold space mechanics. The Citadel was not just a successful biostructure. It was a perfect, self-replicating data repository. Joral felt the cold in his chest intensify, colder than the ether scar itself. The truth hit him like a kinetic warhead. Gresh hadn't sold him tools. Gresh had executed a highly complex data mule transfer. Relith knew the Thriss would immediately create a self-sustaining structure and attempt to escape Relith jurisdiction. The documents Fawn had accessed revealed the depth of their manipulation. Relith didn't care about the profit from the Citadel's cheap water. They cared about the Citadel's contents. Lyra projected the next data layer. She had forced the research file to cross-reference with the Citadel's active structural blueprints. The internal comparison was sickening. The Thriss, in their dedicated effort to build Joral a viable home, had instinctively integrated the failed Relith Project Chimera data into the Citadel's core operational matrix. The Citadel now contained the complete structural blueprints For 300 years of Relith's proprietary technology, every patented crop poison, every water filtration license, every debt algorithm, every engineered scarcity model. It was Relith's entire corporate proprietary knowledge base, compressed into living resin and biological fiber. Joral understood Seren Jokran's parting word. Treason. It wasn't about the water or the land. It was about the potential leakage of Relith's total operational model. If the Citadel was captured, Relith would recover its stolen knowledge and the tools to rebuild their control. If the data was broadcast, Relith's reign of engineered scarcity would crumble across 27 sectors overnight. He was faced with the impossible dilemma. He looked at the Four Sisters, the remnants of Fawn's crystalline filament already dissolving on the console. They had suffered grievous physical harm to protect this structure, knowing its potential. Option A, self-preservation. He could initiate the structural collapse now, total erasure. The Citadel becomes biological dust. The data is lost forever. Relith recovers nothing, and Joral might live to find a different colony, forever running. The millions of colonists hoping for autonomy would remain trapped by the debt clock. Option B, partnership and purpose. He could risk everything to find a way to broadcast the data publicly, turning the Citadel into a weapon of total transparency, but ensuring Relith would hunt them down forever. Joral looked at the fading life sign monitor. Fawn was critical. Kyle and Zis were drained. They had traded their physical security for an ideal. He slammed his good hand onto the console, the pain in his arm receding before the cold clarity of his decision. "We don't run," Joral said, the words heavy and absolute. "We finish the transaction. We flood the system. Lyra, we need a stable platform, far enough from the Scar to launch a high-power comms buoy, but close enough to use the Scar's magnetic interference to scramble the point of origin." Lyra brought up the residual navigational data. A tiny, faint signature flickered 20 kilometers away. Jettison Point Kappa 7, an ancient, forgotten Relith supply depot, derelict, cold, and massive. It was a silent graveyard of shattered steel and ice, a perfect neutral platform. "Kappa 7, it is," Joral affirmed. He directed the remaining sisters to focus their residual energy, not on regeneration, but on the remaining dimensional capacitor. They needed one final, short push. The structural integrity field flickered and dimmed as the energy was shunted. The dome groaned again, the sound tearing at the strained metal connections. The floor beneath Joral's feet became intensely cold, the resin almost brittle. "If this jump fails, the structural fluids will freeze instantly," Joral warned, pulling the heavy salvage comms buoy from an emergency locker. It was a dense, magnetic sphere designed to survive deep space radiation, powered by a small, independent thermal core. "We understand," Lyra confirmed, her concentration visible as a faint internal light emanating from her chitinous joints. Joral focused on the console, punching the coordinates for Kappa 7. He activated the launch sequence, and the Citadel lurched violently, accelerating through the debris field. Rock fragments hammered the rapidly cooling walls. They arrived at Kappa 7 with a jarring crunch that rattled Joral's teeth. The Citadel docked precariously against a towering, rust-colored mass of derelict storage containers. The airlock hissed, protesting the temperature differential, and Joral didn't hesitate. He secured the magnetic comms buoy to his hip and stepped into the vacuum of space, ignoring the agonizing pain in his arm. The external air was 0 Kelvin and utterly silent. He moved across the frozen, chaotic geometry of the depot, found a high-altitude stabilizer strut, and affixed the buoy. Back inside the strained warmth of the Citadel, Joral connected the buoy's input wire to the primary terminal. "Ready, Lyra. Focus everything you have. We need the full 300 years of data to be compressed and broadcast. in less than 10 seconds, or the buoy burns up. Lyra nodded, her entire being centered on the console. Kale and Zis placed their hands on Fawn, drawing on her residual energy, feeding it into the core. The power spike was immense. The citadel flared with a blinding, incandescent green light, and the buoy outside began to hum with unimaginable energy. The data transfer initiated. 3 seconds. The terminal screamed a warning. 5 seconds. The core temperature spiked past the critical point, then, cutting through the high-frequency static and the chaotic debris of the ether scar, a new, heavy gravitational signature registered on the terminal. Massive, silent, and fast. A kilometer above them, a black dreadnought, sleek and obsidian, decloaked. It was not a patrol vessel. It was the personal flagship of Seren Jokrin, the Patience. It had been waiting. The buoy outside achieved 70% of the data transfer just as the Patience activated its main broadcast array. Jokrin's voice returned, deep, cultured, and devoid of pity, overriding the entire comms network of the Citadel. Joral Nistrum, I allowed you to jump because Kappa 7 is the final resting point for all failed Chimera assets. You walked directly into the kill box I prepared 50 years ago. A single, brilliant, crimson beam of focused energy erupted from the Patience's ventral hull. It wasn't aimed at the Citadel's hull. It was aimed at the magnetic comms buoy Joral had just attached to Kappa 7. The broadcast stopped. The buoy vaporized entirely, leaving only a cloud of superheated plasma. The Citadel was safe, but the data was trapped, and the silence that followed the vaporization was heavy, absolute, and filled with the cold certainty of death. Now, Farmer, Jokrin finished, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the terminal room. We will recover my property, piece by fragile piece. The dead silence was the worst part. It wasn't just the lack of external sound, or even the loss of Jokrin's voice. It was the abrupt cessation of the Citadel's internal energy flow. The vibrant, incandescent green light that had heralded the data broadcast vanished, leaving only the sickly blue emergency glow. The low thrum of the life support systems faltered, replaced by a constant, high-pitched electrical whine, the ambient noise of the Patience's constant surveillance systems pressing down on them. Paranoia made audible. Joral stared at the terminal screen where the broadcast status had frozen at 70%. The comms buoy was gone, vaporized by a specialized energy beam that had calculated the exact thermal load needed to stop the signal without triggering a massive debris field explosion. Precision assassination of technology. He felt the immediate, crushing fatigue of total failure settle over him. It wasn't the kind of physical exhaustion that demanded sleep. It was the psychological weight of 63 years of debt, effort, and moral compromise crashing down at once. He had risked everything, including the fragile lives of his partners, on one desperate, ill-conceived broadcast. And he had failed. Jokrin's last words echoed in the small habitat dome. We will recover my property, piece by fragile piece. Lyra, Kale, and Zis stood immobile, their posture rigid, their biostructure lights flickering weakly. They were drawing deep on their reserves, struggling to maintain the minimal structural integrity of the Citadel, which was now docked against the dead, silent mass of Kappa 7, a massive, rusted mausoleum of failure. Joral turned from the console, the pain in his right arm a constant, aggressive throb, the only thing reminding him he was alive. I got us killed, he said, his voice flat, devoid of anger or accusation, just a simple statement of fact. We should have gone with erasure. At least then Relith wouldn't have the data. I traded 50% certainty for absolute zero. Kale, standing by the injured fawn, shifted slightly, a subtle movement of disapproval that carried more weight than any verbal retort. "Don't look at me like that," Joral snapped, suddenly feeling the need to defend his disastrous choice. "I didn't do this for the credits or the farm. I did it because I saw a chance to break their grip. I thought we could actually win." He pushed himself away from the console, stumbling against a cryo-storage unit. He sank heavily to the cold resin floor, ignoring the damp chill seeping through his clothes. Win. The word tasted like stale metal. He was the architect of their doom. Gresh, the broker, had played him perfectly. Jokran, the corporate master, had waited patiently. Joral, the failed farmer, had walked straight into a 50-year-old trap, dragging 4 unique and fragile lives with him. His motivation, the anger at injustice, the craving for autonomy, had been leveraged against him. He was not a hero. He was a piece of logistics, a warm body used to transport invaluable data from Point A, Velisca Prime, to Point B, Kappa 7, the designated recovery zone. He looked at the 3 sentient conduits huddled together, their eyes reflecting the menacing shadow of the Patience, now hovering directly above the Citadel. They weren't judging him. They were simply observing the predictable outcome of human desperation and systemic cruelty. "I was arrogant," Joral murmured, rubbing the tired, scarred tissue on his left hand. "I thought that because I knew how to treat the Thriss as partners, I understood the whole game. I forgot that Relith doesn't use drones because they're efficient. They use drones because humans get tired. Humans get angry. Humans lose focus." He inhaled deeply, the conditioned air thick with the smell of ozone and fatigue. He felt heavy, weighted down by the realization that his entire life, his fight against debt, his technical skill, his flawed sense of morality, had merely been a set of conditions that Jokran had leveraged to his own end. "We are property now," Joral continued, speaking to the air. "You are going back into containment, and I will be liquidated. Jokran doesn't need to send a boarding party. He can wait us out. We have almost no power, and the Citadel is freezing." Indeed, the ambient temperature inside the dome had dropped below 15 degrees Celsius. The cold was a physical reminder of their impending end. Lyra finally spoke, her voice low, a dry sound that scraped against the silence. "The loss is not total." Joral scoffed, a short, bitter expulsion of air. 70% data transfer, Lyra. It's useless. That's enough to panic the local market, but not enough to broadcast the entire 300 years of Relith's structural blueprint. They will contain the panic in 72 hours and spin it as a terrorist attempt. Lyra shook her head slightly, indicating the central console. 70% of the data was commercial. Proprietary crop yields, financial models, water filtration licenses. Project Chimera was the final 10%. Joral pushed himself back toward the screen, his muscles protesting the movement. The core, the real weapon, was the deep structure, the design of the sentient conduit architecture. Without that, the colonists won't know how to replicate the Citadel themselves. "Correct," Lyra confirmed, but the partial transfer was not random. Fawn focused the remaining power on a single data stream during the transfer. She brought up a microscopic feed of the archived files, focusing on the last millisecond before the buoy was destroyed. The stream was almost entirely noise, a dense cluster of digital static. But within the static, a pattern resolved itself. 3,000 lines of deep-level genetic coding, transmitted at the maximum frequency allowed by the damaged system. "What is this?" Joral demanded. "A key," Lyra stated. "A fragment of the original Project Chimera biocode. It is the genetic sequence necessary to unlock the deep structural function of the Thriss bioarchitecture. It is, functionally, the decryption sequence for the 300 years of Relith data trapped within the Citadel." Joral stared at the shimmering lines of code. It was like looking at the single, perfect rivet needed to hold an entire suspension bridge together. "It's only 3,000 lines," Joral whispered. It's useless without a massive computational platform to run the decoding algorithm. The Patience is a massive computational platform, Lyra pointed out, her black eyes fixed on the ceiling where the enemy dreadnought hovered, silently waiting. And it is currently trying to interface with our external systems to initiate capture protocols. Joral understood the bitter, razor-thin opportunity. Jokran believed the Citadel was now a self-contained vault, waiting to be cracked open. He would initiate a remote system link, trying to find a digital back door to shut down the Citadel's remaining life support and force the inhabitants to surrender or die. Jokran was using the bureaucracy of technology, standard Relith Remote Capture Protocol 7 Bravo. It required the Dreadnought to open a secure, high-bandwidth communication channel with the Citadel's dormant external comms array. That external comms array was now nothing more than a fried husk, the original nexus where Joral had rigged the thermal shunt. But Jokran's protocol wouldn't know that. It would simply try to establish a handshake. He is going to open a tunnel, Joral breathed, feeling a fresh spike of adrenaline mixed with dread. A high-bandwidth connection straight into the Citadel's systems, looking for a control node. Lyra nodded. If we could attach the decryption key to that incoming channel, we would use the Patience Syunking tool would be BCK's own computational power to unlock the full blueprint and then broadcast the results using their antenna. It was not a long shot. It was a suicide mission based on abusing the hubris of the enemy. It required one single, massive act of digital aggression, piggybacking a biological code fragment onto a hostile military system that was designed to detect and vaporize any anomalous data packet. We have to physically insert the code, Joral calculated. The decryption sequence is too complex to transfer wirelessly through the jamming field. We need to attach something to the nexus. The original nexus point was 20 meters away, on the outer hull, scarred and melted by the EMP explosion, and the Patience was about to initiate the remote capture. Seren Jokran will realize what we're doing the instant the handshake is established, Joral said, his exhaustion receding before the cold logic of engineering. He has a military reaction time of less than 1 second. We have to open the path, insert the key, and fire the decryption before he can shut the channel down. Lyra held out a small, pale piece of biological resin. It was a dense data spike, the consistency of hardened wax, covered with microfilaments. The 3,000 lines of code were already physically embedded within it. Fawn spent her last focused energy creating this, Lyra whispered. It is keyed only to the frequency of the incoming Relith capture protocol. The choice was not about victory, it was about defining the terms of their defeat. If Joral succeeded, they would die, but the colonists would be free. If he failed, they would still die, and the colonists would remain enslaved. How long until the Patience initiates Protocol 7 Bravo? Joral asked, pushing himself to his feet. Every muscle screamed in protest. His arm felt like dead weight. Lyra looked at the screen, which showed the silent, looming dreadnought. The optimal window is in 4 minutes, 35 seconds. They are calibrating the atmospheric lock on Kappa 7 now. Joral nodded, grabbing a heavy, salvaged multi-tool from the emergency locker. He strapped his helmet back onto his head, the seal hissing tight. I'm going out there. I need you 3 to push every remaining erg of power into the external comms array. Not to communicate, but to keep the melted shell from freezing entirely. I need the port warm enough to accept this spike. He walked toward the airlock, his body feeling heavy, mechanical, and painfully slow. He wasn't fueled by anger now, only by cold, residual responsibility. He had made a bad deal. Now he had to pay the final installment. As the airlock cycle started, a sudden, high-pitched alarm shrieked through the Citadel. It wasn't the external threat warning. It was a proximity alert. Internal. Joral froze, looking back at the terminal. A small secondary blip of light, almost invisible, had appeared on the structural integrity map inside the Citadel's walls. Jokran isn't waiting for the remote capture protocol, Lyra stated, her voice tight with suppressed fear. He sent a single extraction unit using stealth technology directly into the internal structure. The screen resolved the threat. It was a humanoid figure, heavily armored, moving with brutal speed through the ventilation ducts near the power conduits. It was heading not for the bridge, but directly for Fawn. The time had run out entirely. Joral was 20 seconds from the Nexus. The extraction unit was 30 seconds from the weakest link. Go, Lyra commanded, her eyes burning with intensity, fixing on Joral. If you don't plant the spike, Fawn dies for nothing. Joral plunged through the airlock, the heavy door hissing shut behind him. He stepped onto the frozen, chaotic hull of Kappa 7, the biological spike tight in his good hand. The vast, silent bulk of the patience loomed above, indifferent. He ran toward the melted Nexus point, the biospike held high, knowing that the moment he planted the key, the entire galaxy would be watching, and Seren Jokran would have exactly half a second to kill him. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. Joral hit the hull of Kappa 7, the impact jarring through his joints, sending a spike of blinding pain up his useless right arm. He ignored it, focusing entirely on the 20 meters of frozen, fractured metal between him and the melted Nexus. The only light came from the sickly emergency glow leaking from the Citadel's airlock behind him and the cold, oppressive bulk of the Patience high above. The dreadnought was a silent, black monument to corporate power, waiting with the infinite patience of a predator. Joral ran, or rather staggered, across the warped sheets of hull plating. Each bootfall was a loud, grating sound that seemed to shatter the profound silence of orbital death. He could feel the proximity alert, an irritating, high-frequency pressure pulsing through his helmet comms, a reminder of the armored unit moving with murderous efficiency inside the delicate systems of the Citadel. He reached the Nexus point. It was a ruin. Wires melted into plastic slag, the main connection port sealed by a fused ceramic coating, the result of the thermal shunt he had rigged earlier. The surface was too hot to touch, yet the ambient cold of space was rapidly turning the slag brittle. 4 minutes. 35 seconds. That time was gone. They were operating on Seren Jokran's schedule now. Joral dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain. He pulled the heavy multi-tool from his belt, gripping it awkwardly in his left hand. The Relith standard port assembly was designed to be opened with 6 specific hexagonal keys, but decades ago, when Joral worked refinery maintenance, the engineers used to say that the pressure seals were just fancy plumbing. He found the access plate directly adjacent to the main power conduit. The pressure relief valve was fused tight. Joral wedged the sharp end of the multi-tool deep into the seam, leaning his entire 63-year-old weight against the tool, his teeth clenched against a groan. He wasn't hacking the system. He was prying open a stubborn pipe. The ceramic shrieked in protest, then cracked. A small burst of steam and super-chilled coolant vapor escaped, briefly frosting the visor of his helmet. He had a 2-centimeter wide entry point into the defunct comms relay. Lyra, status? Joral rasped into his comms. The response was not Lyra's voice, but a cacophony of internal structural alarms, groans of compressed resin and stressed metal. Extraction unit has reached the 3rd ventilation ring. Kale's voice cut through the noise, strained and thin. Fawn is diverting primary conduit support. Joral pictured it. Fawn, already injured, sacrificing the stability of the entire structure to stay operational and buy Joral half a second. He looked up. The Patience was initiating the handshake. There was no visual cue, only a sudden, profound drop in the electrical interference that had been humming around the citadel. The dreadnought had focused its jamming field entirely, opening a clean, wide tunnel straight into the crippled nexus for the remote capture protocol. Protocol 7 Bravo initiated. "Here we go," Joral muttered. He quickly inserted the biological data spike, the hard, pale resin imbued with the 3,000 lines of decryption code, into the narrow gap he had created. It scraped against the fused interior plating. He drove it deeper with a sharp, heavy blow from the butt of his multi-tool, like hammering a finishing nail. The contact was imperfect. The resin spike established a connection, its microfilaments instantly beginning to interface with the frequency of the Relith incoming channel. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then, the world turned white. The Patience's internal systems, designed to accept a control signal, were instantaneously force-fed the complex, aggressive code fragment. Saren Jokran's protocol recognized the data not as a control node, but as a catastrophic anomaly, a digital grenade fired through his secure channel. Joral didn't need to see the bridge of the dreadnought to know the reaction. The military response time was exactly what he had expected, immediate and overwhelming. Jokran did not try to analyze the code. He initiated an emergency disconnect, a thermal electrical countermeasure designed to vaporize any invading data packet and destroy the receptor it came through. The Nexus port exploded. It wasn't a blast of kinetic force, but a clean, blinding flash of energy expulsion. Electrical fire, intensely concentrated, erupted from the port, turning the remaining ceramic slag into incandescent fluid and vaporizing the biospike instantly. Joral was hit by the backwash of pure, ionized heat. He was thrown backward 3 meters across the hull, his helmet striking the cold metal plating with a sickening thunk. His suit absorbed the worst of the thermal surge, but the light and the noise were absolute. Silence followed the flash, a ringing, painful silence in his ears that meant temporary deafness. He struggled to breathe, tasting the metallic, sharp tang of ozone and scorched plastic. But even through the pain and the ringing silence, Joral saw the evidence of success. The Patience, high above, was broadcasting. Jokran's emergency countermeasure had vaporized the inbound attack, but not before the system had fully processed the 3,000 lines of code. The key was delivered, and since the Citadel's systems had been primed to auto-broadcast the unlocked blueprint through the first available wide-spectrum channel, the code was now using the dreadnought's own massive, high-powered communication array. The Patience was transmitting the entire 300-year deep structure blueprint of the Relith Consortium's bioarchitecture. The Citadel's core, its essence, was streaming across the sector, riding on the back of the enemy's most powerful antenna. Joral watched the sky, a faint shimmer of green light barely visible against the starfield, the signature of the Project Chimera data, the weaponized truth racing toward every hungry, desperate colony system in the outer rim. It lasted 4 seconds. Then the green shimmer vanished as the Patience finally isolated and severed the compromised broadcast system. Saren Jokran had executed the most expensive, most catastrophic self-hack in Relith history. Joral lay on the hull, his body aching, his left hand still gripping the multi-tool, which was now partially melted into a useless lump of alloy. He was alive. He had succeeded in his final, desperate engineering feat. But the silence was absolute. The extraction unit. He staggered back toward the Citadel airlock, adrenaline fading, replaced by profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He pushed himself through the lock, collapsing onto the deck inside the small habitat dome. The dome was dimly lit by the blue emergency glow. It was freezing. The high-pitched whine of the surrounding dreadnought surveillance had been replaced by the quiet, broken sound of dripping fluid and sparking conduits. The air smelled strongly of electrical fire and something else. A clean, coppery smell he knew instinctively. Lyra, Kale, and Zis were huddled around Fawn's containment unit. Their structures were pale, their inner lights extinguished. They were nearly depleted. Joral pushed himself up to see. The extraction unit was there. It was a massive, black, quadrupedal drone built for silent infiltration and surgical extraction. It was caught halfway down the central vent shaft, motionless. It hadn't been vaporized. It had been dissolved. The drone was coated in a thick, green, hardening resin, a waste product the Citadel used to excrete excess biopolymers. Lyra, using the last of her focus, had redirected the Citadel's internal sanitation and waste systems, flooding the ductwork with hyperacidic resin designed to break down competing foreign material. The drone had been instantly immobilized, its advanced sensors and mobility systems overwhelmed by a biological glue engineered by the Thriss to handle toxic runoff. It was drowned in plumbing waste, but the cost was visible. Fawn's containment unit was cracked, stabilized only by Kale and Zis pressing their bodies against the fissure, acting as living structural supports. Lyra looked up at Joral, her large black eyes reflecting the chaos. "The extraction unit is contained," she stated, her whisper now almost inaudible. "But we could not hold both the nexus temperature and the internal structure. Fawn is compromised." Joral stumbled toward them, pain forgotten. He reached out and touched the pale, cracked chitin of Fawn's containment field. It was cold. "No," Joral whispered. He looked at Lyra. "I told you, if we fail, we all fail." Lyra shook her head slightly, a movement of infinite, alien patience. "You did not fail, Joral. The transmission went through. The key was received by every system that was listening." He looked around the ruined habitat dome, at the shattered instruments, the silent, terrifying pressure of the patience still hovering outside, and at the 3 fragile lives reduced to static supports for a 4th failing partner. "We are exposed," Joral stated, his voice raw. "Jokran knows exactly where we are, and now he knows we gave away his entire empire. He won't use capture protocols next time. He'll use fire." The dreadnought above remained silent. No engines, no comms, only the vast, indifferent mass of its hull blotting out the light. It wasn't moving. It was waiting. Joral sank down beside Lyra, resting his good hand on the cool resin of the wall. He had traded debt for autonomy, and now he had traded autonomy for a moment of devastating exposure. The silence was heavier than the old red debt clock ever was. "What now, Lyra?" Joral asked, the question heavy with fatigue and the knowledge of his failure to protect them. "The system is free, but we are stranded. We have no power, no defense, and no escape route. This is all that's left." Lyra did not look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the structural map where the green lines of the Citadel's living tissue were fading, turning gray and dead. "Now," Lyra whispered, her voice dry, utterly devoid of fear, "we wait for the universe to decide if it prefers efficiency or cruelty." The silence that descended upon the Citadel was vast and physical, a pressure more crushing than the vacuum of space. The high-frequency whine of the patient's soul-see surveillance, the groaning of stressed resin, the electric snap of damaged conduits, all faded into a profound nothing. Only the metallic drip, drip, drip of cryogenic coolant escaping a breached pipe offered rhythm to the ruined space. Joral sat heavily on the floor, the chilled metal of the deck plates seeping into his exhausted muscles. He removed his helmet, tasting the recycled coppery air and the metallic tang of his own exhaustion. The left side of his body felt scalded and bruised, and his right arm was a heavy, unresponsive weight tethered to his side. 63 years of slow wear and tear had finally been accelerated into catastrophic failure. Kale and Zis did not move. They were biological buttresses, pale and translucent in the emergency light, their structures locked against Fawn's compromised containment unit. They hadn't spoken since the climax. Their internal systems were cycling at minimum function, dedicated entirely to preventing the fissure from widening. Lyra looked at the floor, her large black eyes reflecting the dome's scattered wreckage. "How long do we have?" Joral finally asked, his voice a dry rasp. "Fawn has 5 hours of minimal life support remaining," Lyra stated, her voice returning to its familiar, low whisper. "Kale and Zis can hold the seal for 8. The Citadel's primary systems are offline. We are maintaining atmospheric integrity by rerouting the nutrient growth filters into a closed loop, but the temperature will continue to drop." Joral reached out and rested his palm on the thin, pale skin of Fawn's damaged shell. It was unnaturally cold. He thought of the 300,000 credits, the debt he had traded for 4 lives, and the single, perfect, transforming ecosystem they had built together. He had promised partnership, not sacrifice. "Seren Jokrin hasn't moved," Joral noted, looking up at the ceiling, though he knew the black dreadnought was far beyond. "Why?" "Efficiency," Lyra replied, recycling Gresh's cold summation with perfect irony. "He could destroy us, but that confirms the existence of Project Chimera and validates the transmission. The entire sector would erupt in open revolt, knowing the means to self-sustain is within reach. We are too toxic to kill quickly. We are the proof of Relith's obsolescence, held captive at the point of origin." Joral nodded slowly. They were trapped in a complex, agonizing game of corporate and political chess. Jokrin would keep them alive, contained, until Relith's legal and propaganda units could craft a narrative. A failed terrorist plot. 4 rogue assets recaptured. The data was corrupted and useless. "They will come for the 3 of you first," Joral said, "to reverse engineer the recovery protocols, to secure the residual data still within your structures." "Yes. And me?" Lyra shifted her focus, an imperceptible movement of her delicate head. "You are an anomaly, a human variable. You are disposable, Joral, but you are also the co-creator. You represent the legality of the acquisition. Jokrin will not waste the energy on you, not yet." Joral looked toward the sterile polymer countertop of the sink, where the aggressive red glare of the debt clock used to burn. The whole section was now a scorched, broken mess, covered in shattered instrument panels and the greenish-gray slurry of the dissolved extraction drone. The clock itself was just a melted black smear. The 300,000 credits had become utterly meaningless. He had spent 5 years staring at that number, allowing it to compress his life into a single, spiteful weight. Now, the number was gone, yet the weight of consequence was 1,000 times heavier. He stood, his knees clicking in protest, and moved to the airlock controls, ignoring the dull, chronic throb in his useless arm. He had enough power for 1 cycle, 1 exit. "I am disposable then," Joral stated, pulling on a thick thermal jacket, leaving the broken suit behind. He clipped a small, inert data chip to the collar of his jacket. It contained his last will, his few assets, and a clean, unambiguous record of everything Gresh had done. "But I can still complicate the bureaucracy." He looked back at the 4 sisters. Lyra, Kale, and Zis were accepting the finality. Fawn was simply waiting for her internal processes to cease. It was an efficiency of suffering he couldn't replicate. When they arrive for extraction, I will be outside the perimeter, on the edge of 11 Gamma. Joral continued, his voice low, steady. It will create a secondary incident. Jokran will be forced to commit ground forces, diverting attention from your delicate systems. You are the key, Lyra. You must preserve the structure, even if you are taken. This is an inefficient expenditure of resources, Joral, Lyra noted, her alien logic unwavering. Your probability of survival outside the Citadel is 0.001%. I'm 63, Lyra. My life expectancy was already low, Joral said, offering a tired, genuine smile. The first since the battle began. I came here for 5 years of my life compressed into a hateful number. I got autonomy instead. I think that's a fair trade. He activated the airlock sequence. The pressure seals hissed, recycling the last of the clean air. You bought us to save yourself, Lyra whispered, the memory of their first encounter. I bought you to be free, Joral corrected. We achieved that. It just turns out freedom is cold, messy, and tastes like ozone and defeat. He stepped into the lock, the inner hatch sealing behind him. He looked through the small viewport at the 3 remaining sisters, their forms still and waiting. The outer hatch opened onto the red dust of Valiska Prime. The air was thin and sharp. The light of the distant sun was weak, illuminating the vast, shimmering, dead structure of the Citadel. High above, the silent black monolith of the Patience watched. Joral walked away from the Citadel, putting distance between himself and the only home he had ever owned. He walked toward the horizon, toward the empty, endless expanse of Sector 11 Gamma. He walked past the field where he had tried and failed to coax life from the soil with steel and chemicals. He walked with an injury that marked him, a memory that defined him, and a debt that was finally paid, not in credits, but in blood and irreversible change. He was no longer a farmer waiting for a miracle. He was the 63-year-old walking catalyst of a revolution built from cheap bioresin and the mathematical certainty of corporate failure. He adjusted the chip on his collar, pulled his jacket tight against the gathering cold, and began to walk, knowing Seren Jokran's eyes were on his back. The weight of the number was gone, replaced only by the weight of the sky and the promise of a long, cold walk. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.